Ave omnibus quibus spectacula Metatron sequentur, ego Metatron sum. Today we are going to talk about the life of a Roman soldier. When we talk about the Roman period and the Roman civilization, we are talking about a very long span of time. So, talking about the life of a Roman soldier is not an easy thing because there are quite a few things to talk about, and things changed over the years, particularly with some very important reforms, which we will cover shortly and briefly during this video as well. Now, let's begin with the res publica, the Republic. Now, during the Republic, the first thing we need to consider is that there was conscription, dilectus in Latin. This dilectus, this conscription, was proclaimed by the Senate. They would proclaim an edict by which all Roman citizens, and please keep this word in mind, Roman citizens, could become Roman legionnaires, Roman forces. They could join the legio. There were some requirements, though, in order to become a soldier. So let's start examining these. The first requirement was age. We don't have a lot of information about the age. We do find some information from Roman writers, for example, from Vegetius. But when we talk about Vegetius, who was not only a Roman writer, but he was also a statesman, there are two things we need to consider. The first one is that he wrote these informations about the Roman soldiers and their life around the 5th century or 4th century. So what that means is that already we're talking about imperial Rome. And the second thing we need to consider is that he was not in the army. He never really served in the army. In fact, in his books and writings, he talks a lot about the organization, but never talks about specific, practical, everyday things. Now, obviously, and what he says the following phrase, which I will tell you in Latin. He says, incipienti pubertate, which basically means anyone who is at least 14 years old. But we know for a fact that there are other accounts and other writers that talk about 17 years old, others talk about 18 years old. The idea is that the age varied, the minimum age to become a soldier, also depending on the needs and also depending on what period we're talking about. But roughly speaking, if we consider most of the archives, for example, talking about Roman soldiers and their service, we could consider 17 or 18 years old to 46. Within the span of a very big one, actually, people could be recruited depending on the situation. Most of the times 17, 18 years old, very young. Now, the second thing we need to consider is the height. There was a minimum height. Now that we do have a couple of accounts. One talks about 1 meter and 72 centimeters, 172, and that was for horseback troops, equestres, and for the members of the first cohorts. For people who belonged to other units or troops and other cohorts and other kind of foot soldiers, the basic minimum height would have been 164. But the height was never the height of a man was never really the most important of the requirements. Actually, probably was the least important of the requirements. In fact, sometimes we know that depending on the need of men to arm for special campaigns or during times of war, and that they actually did not consider that one. They consider the third important characteristics and requirement, which was physical strength. So a boy or a man who wanted to become a soldier needed to have some physical strength. He needed to have stamina. He needed to be have a good constitution. Another important, and that was more important than height. Another very important factor was that he had to be a Roman citizen, and this will never actually change during the whole history of Rome. So only Roman citizens could become Roman soldiers. So when we talk about the Roman army, we're always talking about Roman citizens. They were not a mercenary force. They did use mercenary forces, and those were the auxiliary, but they were never Roman legions, never legionis. And then, last but not least, morality. When we talk about morality, obviously we are talking about a man who never really had any problems with the law. If you had problems with the law, you could not become a Roman soldier. Now, these were the main requirements. But during the Res Publica, you also needed to be the owner, a landowner, or at least a property owner. If you did not own anything and you were poor, you could not become a Roman soldier. Now, the reason for this is actually because there was this idea, this mentality within aristocracy, or Roman aristocracy, that a man who did not owe anything could not be a good soldier because he didn't have anything to defend. Now, this very specific characteristics of the Roman Empire, of the Roman army, will change with the Marian reforms. But we will get to that point in a minute. Before that, we need to consider that during Res Publica there were also several different kinds of troops. It wasn't a whole unified army. That's more of the idea of the imperial legion, not really the republican region. During the Republic, well, the most famous ones would be Astati, Principes, and Triari. But there were also other kinds. What the difference was, basically, was the kind of equipment that they could afford. And so also the social status that they belonged to. Poorer people that still kind of owned something could become Roman soldiers, but if they could not afford the equipment, like Scutum and Gladius, then they would become other kinds of corps, and all the way up to the Triari and Principes who actually could afford proper equipment, because they needed to provide themselves for their equipment. Now, all this will change with the Marian reforms. Now, when we talk about Marius, we're talking about Gaius Marius, and he was a consul. Now, the figure of the magistrates, the consuls and the senate, were very important and very relevant for the Roman forces and the organization of the Roman machina. The reason for that is because the conscription, dilectus, was proclaimed. The Senate was proclaiming the edict for the conscription, but it was the consuls who actually issued the place, date and time where all the soon-to-become legionnaires or soon-to-become Roman soldiers were supposed to meet. If they did not come or did not actually go to this meeting, they could be punished. Now, during this meeting, they would see if all the requirements were met, and then there would be the Sacramentum Militiae, which was an oath that they would pledge for this oath, this vow, to the Roman forces, to the Roman cause. Now, after the pledge, they were supposed to meet at their assigned corps, or forces, which could be actually, for example, located in other areas, in other cities. If they failed to go and present themselves to the actual assigned troop for training, which would normally last around 4 months, they could be punishable with death. And the only way to avoid death would be to present some kind of specific and very detailed written proof, like a justification to prove that they could not attend for any specific valid reason. If they did not have that, they would have been put to death. Now, the whole concept of conscription disappears with Marius, this consul. The reason being that he basically removed this idea of conscription, and the Roman forces became a force of voluntary soldiers. And most importantly, you did not need to own land or to be to have any kind of property to become a Roman soldier anymore. So anyone could become a Roman soldier as long as they met the physical requirements and obviously legal requirements. And that meant that basically the majority of the Roman Empire after the Marian Reform was made mainly of poor people who did not have anything. But that also meant that the numbers of the ranks, the actual ranks, became more numerous. So the Roman Empire became wider, larger. So why did he do that? Well, first thing we need to consider that at that time because we're talking about 107 before Christ, so still during the Republic, but it was towards the end of the Republic. There were quite a few campaigns, battles in the Mediterranean. We have already the Punic Wars had already finished, and quite a few things had been going on in the European area. So they needed troops, and that was a good way to increase the number of recruits. Now, the whole military service would last between 16 years at first, up to 20 years in later times during the imperial time. And there were actually certain situations where the Roman soldiers, even after the end of these 20 years, were kept within the army if they needed to. But this was a very rare situation that actually started to occur. So mainly, most of the times, we could consider 16 to 20 years of service. So why did they do this if it was so difficult to do? Because it was difficult. They needed to be trained, as I said, for 4 months, and then they needed to have all this very, very long conscription, this very, very long service after the Marian Reforms. So why did they do that? The leave. There would be the leave, and which would mean money, quite a lot of money. Now, talking about the leave, there were 3 kinds of leave. The best one that a soldier could hope to get would be the onesta missio. Now, the onesta missio would be like ending your service with honor, and you would get money at first, a certain amount of money, which was quite conspicuous, that would allow you to have a good quality life. But the problem was that the empire in later times started to have problems paying all these onesta missio, all this money that were coming directly from a specific erarium militare that was created around 5 after Christ, Anno Domini, for this specific reason. But the money was not enough, so they actually changed this onesta missio, this final money bonus, from money to land assignments. So to a legionnaire in imperial times, to a legionnaire who would finish his service, would be granted a land. Now, sometimes these lands were in good places, other times they were in faraway places, and they weren't really nice places to work, to live. So quite a few legionnaires, quite a few soldiers who had finished their service would actually sell these lands to gain enough money to go back to their countries, to their cities, and then live a good life. Now, when you finished, the second possible situation would be to receive a leave, an early leave because of physical situation, like for example, sickness or an illness, or for wounds received in battle. But receiving this leave would mean to get no bonus, so you would get no money, so it wasn't something auspicable. The third one would be the worst case, would be to be would mean that your commander, because only your commander could do that, could just send you home, basically, because as a deserter, and that would be a really, really bad position. You will get no money, and often, depending on the situation, you could receive some really serious punishments. Now, a Roman soldier who finished his whole service would become a veteran. Now, the stipendium was the amount of money, the amount of denarii that a soldier would receive as a pay. During Republican times was every year. During the Augustus reforms was every 4 months, so 3 times a year. The amount of denarii at first was 240 denarii every year, but that wasn't a very high pay. As a matter of fact, it would be, if you consider it and divide it daily, it would actually be a little bit more than an operarius, so that would be just a normal worker, hand worker, craftsman, for example. but it will increase and will be actually become 3 times higher during the times of Antoninus, so it will change. Now, the stipendium was instituted after the siege of Veio, so we're talking about 406 before Christ. And before that, we don't have many informations, but we believe that probably, or it is believed that probably the Roman soldiers were paid through the salary or salarium, which meant being paid with salt, because it was a very precious resource at the time. And that's where the word comes from, salary. Even in Italian today we say sale to say salt. Now, very importantly, where was the loot? So how was the loot organized? Now, after a battle, a successful campaign, for example, Roman soldiers would gain a lot of loot, but they needed to give this loot and hand it in to the general. They needed to give it to their general, who then would just put it in the Roman aerarium. But the general, during the Republican era, could decide whether to take a certain amount, a portion of that loot, and distribute it and give it to the soldiers. Normally during the Republican era, this was done after, for example, some heroic acts, or for example after a very good and victorious campaign. During the imperial times, though, things changed. For example, during Augustus, one of the things that changed was the fact that it was not the general to decide to give the loot to his soldiers, but it was the imperator, the emperor himself. And it was not only done during, for example, a victorious campaign or after heroic acts, like in the Republican era, but it was also done during special occasions, for example, special family celebrations, and I'm talking about the family of the emperor, obviously. Now, the reason why there was this difference is because they made this change, they changed that. It was because this way the emperor could ensure to gain the trust and loyalty of the troops, of the Legionnaires. So again, as I say, before the Second Punic War, we don't have any information, no written information about what the soldiers would earn. Now, one of the major differences after the reform, the Marian Reform, was the idea of the fact that the government, the state, was supposed to provide the soldiers their equipment, because we don't have anymore many different fragmented kinds of units put all together, but we had one unified force, heavy infantry. And so they all were wearing normally either lorica amata or lorica segmentata, and they all had scutum, gladius, pugio, and other kinds of equipment. So all of this was provided by the state, but it was, at the end of the first year, it was normally taken from the soldiers' pay. So they were still paying for it, but at least with their stipend. And it was unified, the Roman force was unified. Also, from the annual earnings of any legionnaire was also taken his food, because he needed to pay for that, and it was also they would also take the money needed for their clothing. Now, talking about the food, what did the legionnaires eat, and what was the normal diet of a Roman soldier? Well, what we know is that they definitely used cereals, and when we talk about cereals, we talk about barley at first, which then was changed into wheat. But the reason why wheat was better was also because it was lighter, it was easier to carry, and so it was to carry. And we know that during Marius and also during during the imperial time, the Roman soldiers would carry a lot of equipment. We're talking about between 20 to 30 kilos of equipment. So carrying wheat was a lot easier, and it probably was preferred. It was preferred by the Roman soldiers. So they would receive 35 kilos of wheat, and that would basically be every month. So they would just cook it, add a little bit of salt and water, and make these kind of food, this kind of bread that they would eat. But they didn't only eat cereals, they would only eat meat, and there are some proofs for that. There are two words that they are used to describe what they would eat. One would be frumentatio, and the other one would be comeatus. And the difference was that frumentatio was when they would receive only cereals, so either wheat or barley. And therefore the comeatus, which was the normal one, would mean that they would also receive meat. Most of the times they would use pigs, because those were the ones that they would eat pork. To be precise, lard. So meat was also part of the diet of a Roman soldier. The times in which they would partake of their meals, they would normally have 2 meals every day, they would change depending on whether it was summer or whether it was winter. The idea of modifying the kind of cereal that they would receive was a kind of punishment. So normally normal soldiers would receive wheat, but if they were punished, they would go back to barley. What did the legionnaires, the Roman soldiers, drink? Now this opens a very interesting chapter that I will try to make as short as possible, considering that the video is already taking quite a bit of time. They would drink posca. Now what posca was, it was a mixture of acid wine and water. So we're talking about water and basically vinegar. In fact, posca during imperial times would be called acetum, which means vinegar. Now it's interesting to see that they would drink this and we start posing quite a few questions. Why did they drink water and vinegar? Well, 2 reasons. One, it would be good disinfecting. It was a good disinfectant. It was a good way to sanitize the water that they would drink. And secondly, it was very easy to carry, because we know that vinegar basically can go on not unrefrigerated indefinitely because of its acidic nature. And third, there is actually a third one, it was refreshing. It was a refreshing drink to have for the Roman soldiers, although during the imperial times they were also allowed to drink wine. Now it's interesting to see this because, for example, if you look at the Gospels, to just give an example, or the Bible, we see that the last thing that Christ drank before dying on the cross was vinegar that was given to him by a Roman soldier. So often we see this. There is actually scripture about this. It's in the Psalms, you know, the prophecies that you have in the Psalms. And I'm not going into the religious part, but I'd like to look at it from a historical point of view. In the Psalms, there is a psalm I think it's Psalm 69, if I'm not wrong, which says, and they put gall in my food and gave me vinegar for my thirst, to drink for my thirst. Now this is always seen as 2 awful things, you know, putting gall in your food and giving him vinegar to drink. Well, we need to look at it from a different perspective. We should not look at this event as modern people, but should try to use historical eyes. Not an easy thing to do, but let's try to do that. Now, first of all, the gall that they would put in Palestine at the time was not the animal gall. We're talking about most likely myrrh. And so it was bitter, but still not what we imagine. Secondly, the Roman soldier who gave him the vinegar, he probably gave him posca, which was his drink. So I see it as an act of kindness, not an act of mocking. So I don't see it as a negative thing. Probably the Roman soldier thought, well, he's crucified, he probably soon die, he's thirsty, let's give him a bit of vinegar. For him it was a good thing. So that's my opinion about it. But I know that a lot of people who do sermons at church, for example, see it as a negative thing, but I don't think it was. Now there are many other things that we could say about a Roman soldier's life. I think that this could kind of give us a summary, particularly for the differences that we have before during the Republican era and during the Imperial era. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please let me know, and let me know if you want me to talk more about Roman soldiers and Roman life. There are many other things that we could talk about: reforms, Senate, laws, legislation, emperors, and battles. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you very much for your time. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.